Okay, so again, my name is Ben DiFrancesco. I'm hoping I'll get to talk with each of you here tonight, but if we don't get to chat, these are some places where you can find me on the internet. Please, by all means, reach out. I always love to meet my fellow developers, fellow technologists, learn from everyone, and get to know you. So please do reach out. The talk that I want to give tonight is why developers and entrepreneurs should be excited by blockchain or blockchain-based technology or cryptographically enforced distributed technology, whatever you want to call it. This kind of new world that was introduced with Bitcoin and has since kind of exploded and introduced a whole new set of concepts into the world. And this talk is really going to be kind of trying to take a step back and getting the 30,000-foot view of what is really going on, like trying to see the big picture. So my guess is that there are a number of people here in one of two camps. So some of us are probably relatively new to the idea of blockchains and cryptocurrencies. We've heard about it, there's a lot of hype, we're curious about it, we want to learn more, but we don't really know the details. Probably some of us are also in the camp of having followed this stuff for a long time. You're subscribed to all the subreddits, you're checking coinmarketcap.com every 8 minutes to see what the latest prices are. And you're really down in the weeds with everything that's going on in this world on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's actually useful for both groups to take a step back and again look at that big picture and kind of realize what's fundamentally changed here and what's going to what that might mean over the course of the next, say, 10 to 20 years. And so the claim that I'm going to make here is a little bit radical, and it's that you can kind of divide history into two eras. And you can talk about history in the before blockchain era and in the after blockchain era. And that if you do that, there's kind of there's a fundamental change that's occurred at this moment of time when blockchain comes into existence. So that's what I kind of want to get to tonight, which is what is that fundamental change that's been wrought by blockchain-based technology. But before I do that, if you'll humor me for a second, I first want to step back and kind of do the same thing with a different technology that we're all familiar with, which is the internet. So I want to, again, divide history, the history of the world into kind of two eras, the before internet era and the after internet era. Let's see, maybe if I switch sides. There we go. And kind of try to talk about what changed at the moment in history when the internet became a thing that existed in the world. And so the question that I want to ask to kind of look through that lens is how did one distribute content or make knowledge and information available in the world before the internet, and then how did that change after the internet? So before the internet, if you had some written text, let's just restrict it to written word for now and talk about that. So if you had some written text that you wanted to distribute in the pre-internet era, how would you have gone about doing that? Well, even with the most advanced technology that existed in the pre-internet era, you would be limited to, say, doing something like typing it up on a typewriter or a PC that wasn't connected and then printing it out. And then maybe as an individual, if you wanted to distribute it, you could make a bunch of Xerox copies. You could go to the library and pay 10 cents a copy to make a bunch of copies. And then you could take a stack of papers and walk around and physically hand them to people, or drive around and distribute them to people. And the point, or you could maybe put them in the mail, right, and pay for the postage to get them into people's hands. And the point is that however you chose to do this, if you had written words that you wanted to get into people's hands in the pre-internet era, it was going to cost you a lot of money and a lot of time. And even if you put in that money and time, the scale at which you could realistically distribute your words out into the world was relatively limited as an individual. And so because of these challenges, it basically meant that no one actually did this. This is not something that many or any individuals actually did in the pre-internet era. And instead, what you did in the pre-internet era, if you wanted to distribute your text into the world, if you had something that you wanted people to read, was maybe you went to school and you studied journalism, and then you got a new job at a newspaper or at a magazine, or maybe you wrote a book and then you went and asked some publishers to publish your manuscript. And you might hire an agent to try to help you with that process because book publishers had a lot of people coming to them with manuscripts that they wanted published, right? And there's actually a really good reason that all these institutions existed and that this was the process. And that's that they kind of owned the machinery, the physical printing presses, and also the distribution networks in the form of relationships with retailers and people who could physically move the printed goods out into the world and get them into people's hands. So they paid this big upfront cost that was associated with the distribution of content. And by paying that upfront, they were able to do it at a scale that was economical. And so they served an important purpose, but they also served as gatekeepers to kind of what was distributed in the world and what wasn't. And once the internet became a thing, basically, as soon as the internet became a thing, that completely changed, and it changed for the first time. And the process simply became that you had to type up your words on your PC and then publish them to the web. And anyone who had an internet connected PC and a web browser could then pull your words down. So the marginal cost for the distribution of your information, your thoughts, your words that you had written became zero. So we put a zero into the equation where there used to be a big number that required a lot of upfront investment. And of course, this didn't actually happen overnight. It wasn't like an instant epic that occurred at a moment of time in history. It was built up to by a set of technologies. And then even once the internet existed, it started out as a very small network with like 5 nodes at universities. And so we had a whole transition that had to occur. And you could argue that that transition is still basically, we're still living through that transition. Now I'm going to try to turn this off.
Can you guys hear me in the back if I just talk like this? All right, let's just drop this. So you know, people had to buy PCs, and we had to have companies like AOL come in line and get people online, you know, with dial-up, and then we had to build out broadband networks and cellular networks, and we had to get smartphones into the pockets of every person, and that took 20 years, right, or more, and we're still kind of going through that transition, right? There's still a lot of people in the world who don't have the internet, and we're still dealing with the effects of that change, right? We've seen huge new businesses built. We've seen traditional media companies and their power and influence on the world shift and change. I mean, one could even argue that the current political climate that we're in right now is largely a result of this change in the equation, this change in the way information is distributed, right? So there's been an enormous amount of change that we're still kind of living through because of this change, and because the internet enabled, for the first time, humans to disseminate knowledge, information, and content without the aid of a dedicated third party to absorb those upfront costs of distribution. So this was a fundamental change. This was a fundamental capability that human beings gained when the internet came into the world. And so now I want to go back to the original question that I asked, which was, what is that fundamental change that blockchain technology has wrought on the world, and how might that play out moving forward? And the question that I want to ask here is, how does one transact collaboratively with others? And that phrase, transact collaboratively, I was trying to think of the best way to word this. It's kind of what I settled on. A way that you could say it is like performing commerce with other people, but that's kind of too narrow, actually. When I say transact collaboratively, what I mean is there seems to be something innate in human beings where we have this ability to engage in activities with other humans where there's some kind of transaction, and both parties, or any involved parties, walk away from the transaction feeling as if they have gained something, as if they're better off. So we've been doing this for as long as history has been recorded, right? And the very simple original form of this is just barter, right? So I have something that you want, you have something that I want. We come to an agreement on what a fair exchange for those goods is. We make the exchange, and we both walk away feeling better. So it's a transaction, but it's also collaborative because we're both winning. It's a win-win kind of situation. And so we've been doing that barter for thousands of years. But at some point we moved on, and we got more advanced with this, right? We started using things like precious metals as a store of value and as a means of exchanging value. And then we had currencies that were backed by those precious metals, right? And kind of represented them, stood in for them in our day-to-day transactions to make those transactions easier. And then we moved on to regular old fiat currencies like we have today, where there's actually nothing backing it except the fact that the government, or a government of some kind, says that it has value and enforces that it has value within a nation. And so you have the government that has to enforce that, and you have some kind of central bank that enforces the monetary policy for that fiat currency, right? And our transactions get more complicated. It's not just about exchanging value with one another, right? We set up more complex ways of interacting. And so we have a whole field of contract law where we can write up these clauses and the terms of how these transactions are going to play out. And so we have lawyers and judicial systems and enforcement mechanisms that all come into play to kind of create and execute contracts for our transactions. And we also, of course, banks are in the mix. I probably should have put them earlier, that are providing a whole host of financial services. They allow us to store money, to get credit, all these different things that banks provide, right, and general financial institutions. So again, we're looking at a similar picture where we have this thing that we want to do as humans, which is we want to transact collaboratively. And in order to do that at a larger scale, we've built up this whole network of third-party institutions that allow us to do that, right? That make it economical for us to do that. And once you get beyond this very initial scale of bartering with other people, in order to transact with other people collaboratively, you're relying on, to some extent or another, these institutions to make that possible. And again, that's good. Like, those institutions have served and will continue to serve a really important purpose in allowing those transactions to occur collaboratively. What has changed, though, and what makes me, kind of believe this technology in the long run is going to be really important, is that when Bitcoin was introduced, when the blockchain technology was introduced, for the first time in human history, it became possible to do this, to transact collaboratively without those third-party institutions. So once again, all you need is a PC or a smartphone that's connected to the network and some kind of software that is going to help you carry out those transactions. So some kind of wallet software, or now we have more advanced things like smart contracts that allow you to build much more complex things than just simply exchanging value between two people, right? And what's amazing, so whether or not this is going to replace all this isn't the point, or isn't really the question. The point is that for the first time, we can do this thing. We can transact collaboratively with each other without relying, to at least some extent, without relying on these institutions, right? Some subset of transactions can be moved into this world, and once you get beyond hunter-gatherer bartering style transactions, this is the first time where that's been possible in all of human history. So blockchain enables humans to transact collaboratively without the aid of a trusted third party to execute and verify that activity. And so to me, that is the big change that blockchain technology has wrought. And I think we're at the very, very, very beginning of understanding what that really means. And I think there's going to be a lot of change that comes about because of it. And I think that's exciting. So let's get a little more practical, though, because that sounds like a little bit wishy-washy, like, okay, I get that in theory, but what does that really mean? Like, what does this enable that's different? So let's just look at one way of looking at this, one kind of one set of axes that you can look at to see how blockchain enables different things. So on this side, I want to call this like the scale of the transaction, like how much value is being exchanged, or how many borders are being, like, not borders, but like how big the transaction is, right? And it's not just the dollar amount of the transaction. It's scale in a broader sense. Like McDonald's sells $1 hamburgers, but they sell billions of them, right? So that's huge scale transaction, even though the value of any given transaction is small. So if you consider the scale of the transaction and then the region at which that transaction is taking place, whether it's local, whether it's domestic, so within your nation, or whether it's international. And you consider this, you say, well, what are the kind of transactions that we are involved in today, and which kind of transactions just don't exist in the world, and why don't they exist? So if you're talking about small local transactions, I don't know if you guys can read that, but we have those, right? It's things that you do with your friends and your family. They're usually done with cash. More recently, you might use something like Venmo or PayPal. And they're pretty much enforced solely by social norms and by mutual trust with the individuals that you're transacting with, right? Like, you want to borrow 20 bucks, I give you 20 bucks. If you don't pay me that back, I'm not going to take you to small claims court. It's not worth it from an economic standpoint for me to do that. The time isn't worth it. But you probably are going to pay me back because there's a lot of social norms and pressures that would cause you to want to do that. You just want to be a good person, right? So you're going to pay me back the 20 bucks that I borrow. And kind of a level above that, you have kind of the small and medium business world, right? Operating at a local and a broader domestic level. So these are, businesses that use things like credit cards and regional banking systems, and they sign contracts, they hire lawyers to write those contracts, and their scale is big enough that it's worth them encountering those expenses to do all of those things, because all of those things cost time and money, but they're operating at a scale where it's economical and worth it for them to go through those things to do it. So you have bigger businesses, small businesses that are able to do things like this. And then you get up to the giant scale of like multinational corporations and governments themselves, right? And they're doing things across borders. And in order to do that, they have to rely on international banks, on like complex accounting tricks, right? You hear about how companies like move their money around all over the globe to maximize their or minimize their tax payments and that sort of thing. So they're doing all these very complex things that have a lot of costs associated with it. And this is enforced by things like trade agreements and international law, right? So really complex. Like if there's some dispute between two big companies in different countries, like the jurisdiction in which you litigate that and the lawyers that are involved in making that all, play out is very expensive. And so unless you're a giant multinational corporation or a government, you just don't transact at this level. And down here at the bottom, we have this whole row that we don't have at all, which is like tiny transactions, right? This micropayments. This has been an idea for decades. Micropayments are going to be huge. So we're talking about things on the level of like pennies or fractions of pennies, and we just don't do it because it's not economical in any way. In any circumstance does it make sense to spend the time. So this whole side of this grid that I've set up here is just not worth it, right? It's not worth it for the players involved to carry out any of these transactions because the costs that are associated with them are beyond the gains that you could have from transacting in that way with others. So they just don't happen. So my point of showing you all this is that even if everything that we do today remains the same and isn't affected by blockchain, at the very least, what blockchain does is enable a whole set of transactions to occur which currently aren't happening, right? So at the very least, this stuff becomes possible. And that in and of itself is a huge change. So let's get a little more practical. What do those things actually look like? So tiny transactions. These are things like projects that you might have heard of like Filecoin or BAT, the basic attention token. So the idea with Filecoin is that if you have some spare hard drive space, or if you want to set up a PC that you leave in your living room running all the time with a hard drive in it, you can basically rent that hard drive out to people on the internet, right? And I could say, I want to store some stuff. And so some software encrypts that data for me, and it shards it, and it moves it out into this distributed network, and it stores that data on potentially thousands of people's hard drives. And then I pay you, again, all happening automatically via the software, I pay you fractions of pennies every day in the form of Filecoin in order to store that data on your hard drive, right? So this is not launched yet, but it's been developed by some guys who are some folks who are very, very knowledgeable, who have launched several really successful projects. IPFS, if any of you are familiar with that, the Interplanetary File System, which is kind of a bad name, but that's what it's called. So it's a similar idea, but without the economic layer on top of it. And so they're taking something that exists and they're layering on this economic incentives with Filecoin. And so this is something that I think will be interesting to follow and to see if it's successful or not. Now, I have my doubts about that project in particular. One reason is because regular old storage just through AWS or some other service has gotten so cheap right now that I kind of wonder if they really can compete. But we'll see. And the fact is that it's possible, right? And it's possible. What's also interesting here is that these tiny transactions, it doesn't matter what the region is. It's all online, right? So I could be paying fractions of a penny to someone in rural China or in India to store an encrypted shard of my data on their hard drive, right? And obviously that's not an economical transaction today, but with these networks, it could be possible, right? BAT, or the basic attention token, is another example of this. So this is being developed by Brandon Ike and the company Brave. Brandon Ike is the creator of JavaScript. He was one of the founders, or one of the early employees of Netscape, at least. And the idea behind BAT is that you have a system that's enforced, again, by a token and by the software, where when you're browsing the web, as you're viewing content, your time is kind of divided up, and people are paid out fractions of pennies for your attention on the sites that you're reading or the content that you're consuming, right? And so it's kind of a better alignment of incentives than the current kind of ad-driven model that we have now. And I'm glossing over a lot of details. But again, the point is that that's possible for the first time ever, and we'll see how it plays out if these things actually come to fruition. This area right here is also super interesting. So I was talking with someone just earlier tonight, and we were talking about the idea of smart contracts. So maybe you guys have heard of the idea of smart contract. This is code that you can deploy on a blockchain like Ethereum, and it will execute some logic, and it can be logic that's around the movement of money on the blockchain, and it's cryptographically enforced, right? And it's trusted because of the nature of blockchains. And so, I run a small business. I'm a consultant, and I hire subcontractors a lot. And maybe I want to do a project with someone who has some very specialized knowledge, and they're, again, in some far-flung part of the world, a completely different jurisdiction, a completely different we've never met each other, we don't really know each other, we don't know how to trust each other, but I want to hire them, or we want to do this project together, and we want to split the revenue 50-50 between each other. So today, we just wouldn't do that, right? Because the cost of drawing up a contract that would have any chance of being enforced across the borders of, say, the United States and China is just, it's too big for two small business owners to ever carry through with, right? But today, right now, with smart contracts on Ethereum, you could write about maybe 10 lines of code or something on that order that would set up an address, and you could give that address, you could tell your client, here's how you pay us, you send Ethereum to this address, and then once that Ethereum was sent to that address, it would be split 50-50 between him and myself, or her and myself, right? So this is what's possible now with blockchain. And so we could engage in that activity when before we would never attempt to do that, right? So I'm pretty excited about this. I think it has a lot of potential to make again a big difference in the world. And so I think just like the internet, blockchain technology is going to bring about a lot of change. Much of it is going to be very good. It's going to enable a whole bunch of stuff that isn't possible before. It's going to allow for that human collaboration on a scale that hasn't been possible before. But some of it will be very disruptive, and I don't mean that in kind of like the Pollyanna, San Francisco way of disruptive. I mean literally disruptive. Like it's going to cause problems for people, right? And so I think that this is exciting. In one hand, I think that technologists and entrepreneurs, we have the privilege of being at the forefront of this change, of being involved in this. So I think that we should proceed with enthusiasm, embracing our role, but also learning from the past and learning from what's happened with the changes that have been brought about from the internet, by the internet, and kind of move forward also with some wisdom as well. So that is kind of my take on it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Cool. So Ryan Finley will come up next. I won't take any questions or anything because I want to keep us moving along. We can have some more discussion at the end. So Ryan.